So Hubs,
Howdy, wife.
we've been getting a lot of questions about the difference between a paleo diet and the keto diet. Clearly keto is very popular. People are seeing it everywhere. So let's tackle that today.
Yeah, it's should theoretically be easy to unpack, but there are a lot of nuances. And so maybe let's look at what a paleo diet is first. And you can tackle that by inclusion or exclusion. So the exclusion is a paleo diet is usually free of grains, legumes, and dairy. And the theory behind this is that if we look at what generally was available to hunter-gatherers, and there's some pretty good information around that. People kind of get freaked out about, the veracity or the depth of that knowledge. But in general, we didn't have lots of grains, legumes, and dairy available until the advent of agriculture. So by inclusion, a paleo diet is usually built around lean protein, seasonal fruits and vegetables, root shoots and tubers. That's kind of the story. Now, one of the big challenges with the paleo diet is it's become almost this like religious process, and people end up asking, is it paleo, instead of just asking, is this a good option for me? And when we talk about good options, typically what we're talking about is nutrient density, immunogenicity of the food, like does it cause an immune response? A lot of common allergens, wheat, oats, soy, corn, these things are really common. So not everybody has problems with them, but a lot of people do. So on the ketogenic diet side, it really is quite a bit easier, although Dr. Ted Neiman has a really interesting infographic that kind of breaks down the different ways to get into a ketogenic state. But in general, what we're talking about is a carbohydrate restricted diet, and we have adequate protein and then fat to a degree that kind of flips the lever of, if we are a performance-oriented athlete, we probably eat a lot of fat to make up the calories that we need. If we are looking to lose body fat, then we need a caloric deficit, and so we're going to set our fat levels somewhat lower. So on the paleo diet side, we also have the additional caveat, what I would call the Paleo Template, which is looking at sleep and circadian rhythm. We're thinking about community, we're thinking about the gut microbiome, and so it's really what we would call, in broader terms, an ancestral health or evolutionary medicine template. The ketogenic diet fits within that story perfectly, and really I've made the point that the paleo diet should be approached in what I call a macronutrient agnostic fashion. And what that means is we're focusing on food quality first, and then you figure out what the relative ratios of protein, carbs, fat are that you need to work optimally. I'll use myself as an example, just briefly. Despite being much healthier than what I was in my 20s and 30s, I'm still not super duper carb tolerant. I'm better than what I was in the past, but a really large bowl of rice or something like that is going to give me sky high blood sugar levels. We've done some self-experimentation where you ate the rice, I ate the rice, we checked blood sugar at 2 hours, and you kicked my ass on it. Like your blood sugar barely got above like 110 or something. Mine was nearly 190, which is near diabetic levels. So that is a piece of this story. To be healthy, need to eat a lower carb intake. I'm also quite gluten intolerant. If you eat a piece of French bread, you'll get a little bit of kind of belly swell, but it's not that big of a deal. Like 2 hours later, you're fine. So these are kind of the personalized nutrition elements that we end up augering down and getting more granular for each of us. And this is what we're recommending to other folks is, look at this big picture of what goes into a paleo diet, which is typically whole unprocessed foods. Nutrient density is kind of a primary concern, but that all applies to a ketogenic diet as well. And there are a lot of people for whom a ketogenic diet is really the best tool in the tool shed. There are some people for whom a ketogenic diet may not be the appropriate tool at all. And it's fine to recognize that. We don't need a one-size-fits-all world, even though lots of people try to make it that way. If all that we had were hammers and nails, our houses wouldn't stick together all that well. I would make the point that in many ways, approaching the world from this ketogenic diet perspective could simplify this whole story, or just low carb. And here's kind of my thought. We look at what your carb tolerance is, and this will be determined by genetics, by epigenetics, including your sleep and kind of circadian rhythm. We know from the work that we've done with the Reno Police and Fire projects that people who are in circadian rhythm disrupted environments, basically shift work, they're insulin resistant. And the only lever we have to flip from there is their nutrition, and typically we recommend a low carb diet. So we find the carb level that works well for folks, and then we just look at this range of what I would call immunogenic foods, which is typically grains, legumes, and dairy, and we just ask a question. Do I do well with those foods? And the way that we determine that is an elimination diet. We remove these foods from the program for 30 days, reintroduce, and see how you do. And so in that regard, I would almost argue that a simpler approach is using low carb or keto as a baseline. Add in these other elements of the evolutionary medicine story, sleep and circadian rhythm, gut health and whatnot, and it really simplifies the process. Instead of asking a million questions, is this paleo? Instead, we have a really stepwise process where we start with appropriate glycemic load, then we find out if we have immunogenic problems with foods, basically intolerances, and we set amounts and ratios appropriate for what our goals are. And then also flesh out the rest of our lifestyle with an eye towards sleep and gut health.
Now, it's interesting because clearly a ton of people have lost a lot of weight on a paleo diet, and a lot of people are losing a tremendous amount of weight on keto. And I think the easier bit with keto, and I'll have you expand on this a bit, is that like with paleo people, like you mentioned, there's certain foods that you don't eat, but there's no real limit on calories, right? Like you're not specifically limiting your caloric intake. Whereas on a keto diet, especially if you are someone who has a significant amount of weight to lose, it can really help simplify things because you are eating at that caloric deficit.
Yeah, like some folks like the Keto Games folks and whatnot, they have done a great job of helping people to determine an appropriate macronutrient ratio, adequate protein, carbs, fat, so that they're in that ketogenic state, but more importantly, they're in a mild caloric deficit. And the results that they're getting are absolutely remarkable.
Anything else you think people should know? I know there's another question that came up also. How is keto different from Atkins?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And really, they're kind of kissing cousins. And the distinctions become really, although whole religions have been founded on minor distinctions in philosophy, but Atkins historically has been a ketogenic diet for about a 2 to 4 week period, an induction phase. Tends to reverse insulin resistance, tends to help people become what we would call fat burners. And then from there, Atkins historically recommended that you titrate carbohydrates up to a point in which you don't see problems. And so they end up being very, very similar. There's also a thing called a modified Atkins, which is a higher protein intake than what we would typically see within standard ketogenic diet circles. And then finally, if we really dig into the history of the ketogenic diet, the classic nutritional ketogenic diet that is used for epilepsy was a very high fat, very low protein, low carbohydrate diet. That's not necessarily what we and most people in this kind of performance and aesthetics world are recommending for the vast majority of people who just want to look, feel, and perform better. But there is definitely a place for that well-formulated nutritional ketogenic diet for things like epilepsy and other neurodegenerative conditions.
So babe, given you've helped so many people lose weight, transform their health with paleo, and like we've mentioned, keto is very popular right now, and we're seeing lots of people, especially people who've just struggled to drop, maybe they're 300 pounds, 400 pounds, and they've just struggled to find something that would work for them, and they're finding tremendous success with keto. So to that end, we've been working on a big project. Do you want to tell folks a little bit about that?
Yeah, and before I mention the project, I will mention some people, it appears, if they have been significantly overweight for long periods of time, they may actually have some alterations in their hypothalamus, the energy regulating center of the brain. And up until this point, every approach that these folks have tried has typically failed. They're always hungry. They're debilitated by hunger and a desire to effectively overeat. And the ketogenic diet is interesting in that it appears to reset that hypothalamic dysregulation. And particularly over the course of time, we've seen a lot of reports of folks like you mentioned, 300, 400 pounds in body weight, significantly overweight. And for the first time in their lives, or at least for the first time in immediate memory, these folks are not chronically hungry. And so there's something about that ketogenic state that allows people to regulate their hunger and to eat appropriate amounts of food, and they subsequently have some pretty great success. And that success is the reason why we put together this program, which is called the Keto Masterclass. The Keto Masterclass is a 13-module course, which includes a 13 video module course. It includes a comprehensive workbook. It has some really cool bonus features.
It's a 45-day program, so it guides you through 45 days of your eating, your tracking your sleep, and paying attention to a lot of these different levers that factor into weight loss, and then also exercise.
Right, yeah. And even though it's comprehensive, it's simple. It is a simple program. You don't need a PhD in biochemistry to be able to navigate this program.
Great. And if folks want to check out the Keto Masterclass, you can click the link that's in this ad, and we're going to ask some questions, because a lot of people who get started on a new way of eating typically run aground in a couple of areas, either social situations, co-workers, family members. They kind of derail what the person is up to, kind of a little bit of sabotage going on. Oftentimes folks can get started and they're on a great path, but then life gets in the way and they get really busy and time crunched. Or folks are doing great, but then they hit what you call the
dreaded plateau.
The dreaded, but the perceived plateau.
Yeah,
so we have some strategies for that. And then also just figuring out how to do it right. So how much protein, carbs, and fat do I eat? How do I go about this new way of eating? And so we'll ask some questions to kind of figure out what your challenge is, and we'll be providing some tips to address those challenges as well. And then from there, if you're interested in signing up for the Keto Masterclass, there'll be information for you to do so as well.